This sitting is resumed. Senator Lady Haynes, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And I rise this evening to speak on the Appropriations Act 2018. And inasmuch as there are major concerns about the state of our economy, which we have discussed extensively over certainly the past 2 years, with the increasing concern in the face of the 1.7 billion deficit, or dwindling foreign reserves, currently at the 22-year low, as described by the Governor of the Central Bank, our high debt to GDP levels, and the delayed implementation of some of our foreign-funded projects. Yet, Madam President, there are some positives in the slight growth in the economy over the year, the significant reduction in government's dependence on the central bank, and projects on the horizon which might give us encouragement. I want to begin this evening, Madam President, with a few comments on Head 23, Health, and to include under that, of course, HIV. And I'm going to begin by congratulating the Ministry of Health on its results in trying to meet the global UNAIDS 90-90-90 goals by 2020. Those goals are threefold. Firstly, that 90% of people living with HIV know their status, which means that we have to be encouraging people to test for HIV more broadly. Secondly, that 90% of the people who have tested HIV positive are on treatment, and then that 90% of those people on treatment have their viral load suppressed. And the significance of the viral load being suppressed means that really the virus is no longer detectable in their bodies. The statistics from the Lady Mead reference unit shows that 81.9% of people meeting the criteria for treatment at the end of 2013, which are our last available statistics, were in fact on treatment. And I think that is significant, Madam President, that we are aiming for 90% by 2020, and they are currently at 81.9, call that 82%. And I think that is very significant, and we need to congratulate them. More recently, Madam President, the Ministry of Health implemented, I believe in 2016, the Treat All program, whereby treatment is started once you have a positive HIV diagnosis and no longer guided by the viral load or CD4 levels. The CD4 is a cell for which we test. And initially, we had started at a level of 250, which meant that people's bodies were significantly immune compromised by the time we started treatment. Over the years, we moved that CD4 level to 350 and then to 500, which means that we were able to be treating people much more early in the disease. The World Health Organization's Treat All program, which our Ministry of Health signed on to in 2016, actually means that everyone with an HIV positive diagnosis, regardless of the status of your immune system, is automatically treated. And therefore, that has had significant results globally in bringing down the level of HIV infections. There are still red flags out there, Madam President. The men are still presenting very late in the disease, and that is with full-blown AIDS and not when they are HIV positive. And in 2013, which are the most recent statistics available, 2/3 of the new HIV positive cases were in fact men. So 71 of the 104 men in that year were positive. In fact, the most recent Knowledge, Attitude, Beliefs, and Sexual Practice Survey, 2013-2014, which is the most recent survey that we have available, shows that, first of all, the population, the sex distribution of the survey population was consistent with that of our 2010 Barbados Population and Housing Census. That is that 51.2% were females and 48.8% were males. Of interest in the sexual history was that over 80% of those respondents were sexually active in the 12 months preceding the survey. And of those who were sexually active, 45.4% reported using a condom the last time they had sex. Turning that around, however, Madam President, that means that 54.6% did not use a condom the last time they had sex. Interestingly, there were also 38% who had had sex under the influence of alcohol and 12.6% under the influence of non-prescription drugs. When we looked at condom availability, whereas almost 100%, 97.5% knew where to get male condoms, only 45% knew where to get female condoms. In looking at the conclusions coming out of that and the programmatic recommendations, I just wanted to flag 3 of them, which were, in fact, 2 of them. One was to develop and implement target interventions, inclusive of new messages for the affected populations, to encourage the practice of consistent condom use as a means of protecting themselves from contracting HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. And secondly, that more innovative campaigns or initiatives should be developed and implemented to promote HIV testing, particularly among those who had never been tested. And this will affect the incidence not only of HIV, but of other sexually transmitted infections like chlamydia, herpes, syphilis, and gonorrhea. And the Ministry of Health in 2013 discovered, in fact, in 2011, when they started looking at the syphilis cases, there were 24 in 2011 and increased to 112 over the year in 2013. So there was definitely a significant trend upwards of syphilis at that time. This trend now seems to have stabilized, because in 2014 there were in fact 100 new cases as compared to 112 the year before. But interestingly, the number has not come back down, and therefore sexually transmitted infections continue to be a problem. And Dr. Anton Best at the time actually revealed that the majority of cases, 72% of them, had occurred in men in the ages 15 to 49. There were also, I believe, 17 cases of HIV positive women who tested positive for syphilis, with 3 or 4 of them, in fact, delivering babies with neonatal congenital syphilis. These are significantly worrying facts, Madam President. In my presentation last year, I had referred to the staff complement of the Lady Mead Reference Unit, which prior to that had included a clinical consultant post. And I shared my personal experience at that time, having been both a student and an intern, as to the importance of having access to a consultant for teaching. So you would understand my interest this year in wanting to know whether the consultant post had been filled. I believe that it is an established post, Madam President, so this is not something to which we need additional funding, but it just needs for the post to be filled. To echo once again how important the learning process is when you have a consultant, but even more important than that, Madam President, how important it is for the patient population to have access for a consultant. Because there are always going to be 10 or 15% of the patients who have more difficult cases, whether it is that they have co-infection, they have HIV and tuberculosis, or they have HIV, tuberculosis, and hepatitis B, or they have difficult side effects from the drugs, but there are always going to be that percentage of people that will need that consultant skills. And therefore, Madam President, I once again make my plea, I believe on deaf ears, but once again that they consider filling that establishment post, because it is essential. In addition to the clinical services, the Lady Mead Reference Unit is responsible for disease surveillance. And I believe also that there is a similar shortage in the nursing complement there. What that does is, if you have a shortage of a public health nurse, the public health nurses are in fact the nurses who are responsible for HIV surveillance. So they would go to the hospital and correlate clinical cases and the testing, And that is how we get our annual statistics. And I believe, statistics are absolutely essential to guide the program. And I believe that that may well be the reason why our most recent statistics are 2013. We therefore really do need to see that clinical consultant post filled, as well as having at least one or two public health nurses, so that we can get our surveillance back up to date. Senator Bayer, the leader of government business this afternoon, spoke to the best DeSantis public health laboratory. And the HIV program, and this I have to give them full marks, when the funding that we give, that goes to them from government, doesn't only go for HIV treatment and drugs and management, but also for health system strengthening. And this Best DeSantis Laboratory is a good example of that, because it was a collaboration between Barbados and the United States government, and the US had in fact agreed to fund that project to the amount of $6 million, which was from PEPFAR and some Global Fund money as well. I want to underline, Madam President, how important bilaterals are as we have difficult economic conditions, and very often the bilaterals can be very, very useful to us. The HIV Commission has said in many of their programs that the responses to people living with HIV have to be multifaceted in order to break the vicious cycle of stigma and discrimination. And I cannot stand here, Madam President, and speak on HIV without speaking to stigma and discrimination. Stigma and discrimination will ultimately lead to human rights violations. Remembering that stigma is the attitude, discrimination is the act, which inevitably leads to a loss of human rights. And stigma, Madam President, builds on existing power relations, and it will reinforce the existing social inequalities and prejudices. And I am joined with the leader of government business this afternoon in celebrating the very important social legislation that this Parliament has passed, in particular the Domestic Violence Act and the Sexual Harassment in the Workplace, both of which help to address these power relations. The end result of discrimination is that people feel it's not safe for them to seek treatment, and they're forced underground and will often therefore continue their unsafe sexual practices, and therefore the potential spread of HIV. Under sub-program 365, Madam President, in 2016, the Ministry of Health also initiated another very significant program called PrEP, Oral Pre-Exposure Prophylaxis of HIV Infection for the Prevention of HIV. And that sounds like a mouthful, but it's basically just pills that you can give somebody to prevent them getting HIV. But what is new about this, because we have antiretroviral treatment that's already available in Barbados, and it has been state-of-the-art antiretrovirals, so that people with HIV here have access to exactly the same medication that they would have in London or New York. But what this does now is offers treatment to people who are HIV negative, who are at risk of contracting the disease. This didn't come out of nowhere. It was, in fact, a World Health Organization program, and it was done initially with men sleeping with men, gay men, and it was so effective. Taking the pills was so acceptable, the results were so good, that it was decided to broaden the recommendations and to include all the population risks at substantial risk of HIV infection. It is now the policy of the Ministry of Health that this be offered to any person deemed at substantial risk of HIV in Barbados. And this is excellent, Madam President. However, my concern, Madam President, is when I look in the estimates, Senator Walcott referred to it, under Head 23, Program 365, HIV/AIDS Prevention and Control Project, and I look under supplies and materials, I see this significant reduction by almost 50%, from 6.5 million in 2017-2018 to 3.1 million for this 2018-2019 year. My concern is, Madam President, how can we be offering PrEP? We are offering to treat all, and we are offering to treat people who are not infected but at substantial risk, and reducing the amount of funding that we have available by 50%. So I just flagged that as a huge concern, Madam President, and I am sure that it will be addressed. I also want to deal with I'm looking now at the pharmaceutical program, and I want to comment briefly on this, as this is not a new comment for me, Madam President. I believe this is probably the third year that I've made this comment in debates on the drug service and access to drugs. Everyone understands the need to cut spending, and this area is no exception. But I once again want to put on the table, Madam President, my real concern about how this affects the older and the elderly patients. And I'm going to tell you why. It is my understanding that the April 2018 formulary, which is coming out to be for 2018-2020, and it is due to come out in April, will have very few combination drugs on the formulary. Virtually all of which have been replaced by individual generic drugs. So by combination drugs, I mean that normally you have high blood pressure, you are on one drug, it's difficult to control, so you have to add a second one, and sometimes for some people, you have to add a third drug. What we have been able to do is to give them a combination drug so that they are in fact taking less drugs. Taking less pills is very important, particularly for older people, because if they're going to comply, I honestly, Madam President, don't know. I can barely manage to take a vitamin. I don't know how older people take this handful of drugs, because just for diabetes, one drug, if you are fortunate enough to be just on one drug, you can be taking 2 large tablets 3 times a day, and that is one drug. Most diabetics are taking at least 2 drugs. And now if you're taking another set for high blood pressure, and instead of being able to use a combination, you're now back to another 2 or 3 drugs, Madam President, a lot of patients are not going to comply. It is going to be difficult for them to comply. Just as important, it is going to be an additional cost to them. And this is something that I've put on the table before also, because as it currently stands, for patients who are seen in the private sector, for every drug on that prescription, there is a cost. So you don't pay for a prescription, you pay by each drug. So the person who is on 1 or 2 drugs is going to be paying significantly less than someone who has 6 or 7 drugs. So by getting rid of the combination drugs, you are causing even more problem and more discomforture, not just in terms of compliance now, but in terms of cost. So I make that plea once again, Madam President. Moving from health to youth, and particularly Head 78, the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Youth. And I'm sure you may wonder, Madam President, why would I select culture, sports and youth, given the many other very serious problems that we are currently facing, as have been outlined in here already this afternoon. Things like our drainage, our sewage, garbage, and the list goes on a bit, our bus services. I'm going to explain to you why I have selected this head. And it is because in our current economic situation, and particularly where the area of international business has taken a significant beating through no fault of our own, I would like to posit, Madam President, that the area of culture and sports together form a strong platform on which to build our economy once it is given the correct support by government in order to make it an enabling environment for the private sector. This is an area, sports, madam, is an area in which much has been quietly achieved in this country. And I don't believe that enough attention has been paid to the achievements of individuals, and I'm going to spend a little while just going through listing some of the achievements of our young athletes, so that I hope I will raise the same feelings of passion about our young people and the need for them to be supported. I have a few other reasons for focusing on this, Madam President. Firstly, of course, because it's about young people. They are the leaders of tomorrow, and there is a strong connection not just between sports and medaling and big meets, but also sports as a way to develop our youth. Secondly, because of the immense amount of talent in our young sportsmen and women. And thirdly, we need to engage at a time when our athletes need all the investment that is available, given the upcoming calendar of global sports over the next 2 years. And this is an area in which I do believe more can be done to find creative, and I say that in a positive way, because when you talk about creative funding, people get strange ideas, but positive, creative ways to attract support from a wider cross-section of stakeholders. So over the next few minutes, my plan is firstly to share some of the information regarding our extensive sporting talent. Secondly, to share a little bit of the research as to what may have worked elsewhere. And then finally, to seek to underscore the importance, I think, in this estimates debate of finding ways to make funding more accessible through governments facilitating significant private sector sponsorship as we seek to develop our youth. So let me begin with tennis, Madam President. In a previous debate, I shared that I had done some dancing with Barbados Dance Theatre. So let me share this time that I was a tennis player, Madam President, in my youth. so tennis was my first love. But let me begin with the tennis currently, and with the 8 major tennis tournaments, the Grand Slam tournaments, which began with the Australia Open in January this year. But in addition, we have the Women's Cricket World Cup coming up, the Commonwealth Games, and for track, the Carifta Games, the Regional Pan Am Games, Central American and Caribbean Games, and of course, the never to be forgotten 2020 Tokyo Olympics. Last year, when I spoke on the head of sports, we were on a high. Darian King had taken a set of one of the most highly ranked French tennis players, Gaël Monfils, and since then, in his first ever US Open match in New York, he gave the number 6 seed, talented young German, a serious run for his money. And the International Tennis Federation actually named, and hear who I say, Madam President, it is the International Tennis Federation who named our Darian King from Barbados as one of the 5 people last year who proved invaluable to their countries, and therefore as one of the 5 MVPs for last season. He, in fact, last year received a career high ranking of 106, and he is the first tennis player representing Barbados to have made the main draw of a Grand Slam tournament. Earlier this year, unfortunately, he fell 1 match short of qualifying for the Australia Open. He won his first 2 matches, but lost the 3rd and final of his qualifying. This year, so far, we have not been as successful, as earlier this month, Barbados lost to Colombia in the just completed Davis Cup Group 1 match. However, let us note that they were able last year to move us from Group 2 to Group 1. Note, however, Madam President, that the doubles team for Colombia were in fact the finalists in the recent Australian Open tournament. So that is the kind of competition that we are up against. This team, under the non-playing captaincy of Damien Applewhite, included 2 young players currently at scholarship at US universities, Matthew Foster Estwick and Xavier Lawrence, as well as 15-year-old Capo Marshall. We are, however, still in the competition with a match against the Dominican Republic slated for April this year. And 2 losses can't be a reason to turn our attention from this young group of talented tennis players, and in particular, Darian King, who is considered in anyone's books an elite athlete. All the more reason, in fact, to spend some time looking at how to invest in this team, some of whom are still juniors. The reality of moving our sportsmen, and of course, in this case, Darian, to the point where he is initially eligible and then competitive in a Grand Slam tournament requires significant investment. Not just in getting him to tournaments around the world, because the Grand Slams are around the world, but to ensuring that he has a professional team around him to include his wonderful brother, who is his coach, his manager, a trainer, and a physiotherapist at a bare minimum. All these would, in a perfect world, need to travel with him when he goes to these tournaments. Among young tennis players, there is much to be optimistic about, apart from Matthew Foster Estwick and Sinon Williams. The names of 19-year-old Xavier Lawrence, 15-year-old Capo Marshall, who I just mentioned, his older sister Kano Marshall, Gabrielle Leslie, Melina Lopez, and most recently, 13-year-old Hannah Chambers are all names with which we have become familiar. Hannah Chambers, at 13 years old, played earlier this year, in the Good Time Snack Tournament and won both the under-16 and the under-18 singles titles at 13. So we cannot... I am so happy to hear that noise, that support, because I am really wanting to leave here this afternoon convincing my colleague senators, but people in Barbados who could listen to, or maybe listening, how important it is and how good our young people are. And if we are going to move between just watching them play here and move into the global arena, and therefore also be a huge inspiration for other young people, we have to find ways to find money to invest in them. To digress briefly from sports to music, Madam President, among other things, Rihanna has shown us how significant achieving global recognition in a stellar career and always showcasing Barbados can be. On the occasion recently of the renaming of Westbury Road to Rihanna Drive, Prime Minister went through a long list of her significant achievements, among them her philanthropy. Rihanna has since then won her 8th Grammy. She has had this month her 2016 album, Auntie. She now boasts of being the #1 singles in dance club singles, beating Katy Perry in chart history, in the history of the charts. And of course, her 40 Shades of Fenty line of makeup is already totally out of stock in stores internationally. Rihanna has shown the world that she's an unmistakable star, an entrepreneur, a philanthropist, a fashion diva, and at the core, an unrepentant and proud Bajan. Every time I speak of music, there's always another brand to which I have recently been exposed, of which we can be proud. And on this occasion, I'm speaking about the recent Honey Jam concert at the Frank Collymore Hall. Several of these young women, new to the genre of jazz apparently, had the most powerful, earthy voices reminiscent of any internationally acclaimed female jazz great that you can think of. So my concern is how do they get to the next stage, and from there into the global arena. Miss Ebony Rowan, I'm sure she won't mind my calling her name, has done a superb job over the years in providing the opportunity to showcase these talents, and this year in actually providing vocal coaching and mentoring by a Canadian artist, Shakura Seda, through the sponsorship of the Canadian High Commission here in Barbados. I know that she does get some local contributions, but funding for these events has been a challenge for her. And so my question is, what can government do to make the provision of support a more attractive proposition for the private sector, the most generous of whom are tapped repeatedly to support local initiatives? I want to refer, Madam President, to another bilateral, as I'm speaking about bilaterals with Canadian support for us. And I want to recognize the gesture that I read in the papers of the Argentina ambassador to Barbados, Ambassador Pandiani, himself a footballer, who has recently offered to be a representative for both the Argentinian and the Barbadian people through arts and sport, with more football coming to Barbados from Argentina, and in fact cricket going to Argentina from Barbados. He is arranging for Argentina football coaches to come here, and particularly he's interested in working with the Second Chances, it's called, Second Chances program, and also then 2 coaches from Barbados to visit the Argentina National Center of High Performance Athletics. Madam President, these are 2 examples of wonderful bilateral support, and I feel that we should try to initiate support from these kind of initiatives more often. So could there be tax concessions made available to encourage the tangible support for these young and talented people? I've mentioned in this instance the women from Honey Jam, but how many times have we seen exceptional musical performances from young musicians playing the trumpet, playing the saxophone, playing the guitar, playing keyboard, and Madam President, even at Honey Jam, a talented female drummer, and indeed young producers. But at the end of the exhilarating performances, I can't help leaving and wondering, how do they get to the next stage? The Barbados Sustainable Recovery Plan 2018, Madam President, and I have had, long before social partnership, I have had a very good experience, which I believe I've spoken to in here before, with the HIV workplace policy, which was exactly a social partnership. It was the labor, unions, government, and private sector. And so I am fully supportive, and I think once you have that kind of buy-in, I think there's no question that it can go places and can be very effective. On page 26 of this document, under the private sector-led growth framework, it reads, "A strong and vibrant private sector is very important for economic growth, particularly when government resources are scarce and it is unable to fully engage in activities to help fuel growth. Hence, in the current low-growth environment, government will have to expand its role as a facilitator by promoting a business-enabling environment. Specific to this would be, and there are 8 points, but there are 3 that I want to flag. One is having a non-distortive taxation and correcting fiscal imbalances so as not to restrict growth and investment. Secondly, to enhance business facilitation and create attractive investment opportunities for investors. And thirdly, to promote creative ways to unlock and leverage private sector resources and support." And it ends by saying, "For its part, the private sector must seek to capitalize on opportunities to invest and to create wealth and employment." Back to sport, Madam President. As a member of the Optimist Club of Bridgetown, we have over the past few years made it a point of recognizing annually young people who have excelled at community level, but particularly in the area of sports. And once I began to focus on sporting achievements, I realized that, disappointed as I may have been with cricket over the years, Madam President, because I am a die-hard West Indian supporter, but I recognize that we do have this year, Shea Hope was in fact the 2017 National Sports Personality of the Year, particularly for his outstanding achievement of scoring 2 centuries in a first-class match at Headingley in England, which was the first time it had ever been done. So we do have good news in cricket. But road tennis, Madam President, it's probably the one sport that we can claim as a truly indigenous Bajan sport. It became popular way back in the 1930s in the parish of St. Michael. But more recently, in 2016, a World Road Tennis Championship was held in Barbados over 4 days, sponsored by the City of Bridgetown Credit Union and Turbo Energy Drink by SM Jaleel. That tournament, Madam President, attracted players from 5 or 6 countries. It was an international tournament. And in December 2017, the inaugural 30 and under road tennis tournament was staged, and the annual National Sports Council Island Interparish Road Tennis Tournament which sees names like Rachel Smith, Kim Holder, Abigail Haynes, Sheldon Waldron, Darius Gaskin, Julian Michael Jackson White, Little Man Daniel, and of course, Mark Venom Griffith, among others emerging as winners. Madam President, Abigail Haynes is particularly impressive, having just become the women's champion in the National Sports Council Inter-Parish Road Tennis Competition, having first won that competition 9 years ago when she was 16 years old. So I think that is very impressive. Road tennis, as we know, is a totally community-based sport. It requires only a flat surface, 10 by 20 feet, very little equipment other than a tennis ball, plywood rackets or paddles, no specific attire, and it's very popular at community level. In the past few weeks, I've seen reports on several community tournaments, most recently the Silver Hill Road Tennis Tournament and the Vincent Snowcone Wilkinson Amateur Road Tennis Tournament in Bush Hall. Government, I understand, does have a road tennis program in the schools, and there are a number of primary school players who have emerged throughout these tournaments. But given the trajectory that road tennis is taking, the fact that it is our one indigenous sport, it will require major sponsorship and certainly more than one road tennis coach in the schools and in the communities to take it along that road. Turning to squash. 15-year-old St. Michael's student, Megan Best, the reigning Caribbean and national senior women's champion, last year reached the last 8 of the Pan American Championships in Argentina. She went on to win a silver medal at the Junior Canadian Open, and as if that wasn't enough, went on to win a gold medal at the Junior US Open, and become, in fact, the first player from the Caribbean to win a US Open title. Antoinette Downey, a primary school teacher, had 3 top finishes in the International Federation of Bodybuilding Women's Physique stage. And how many people know of the British-based 17-year-old cyclist, Amber Joseph, a sports science student at Reading College, who won gold and silver medals at the Junior Pan Am Championships in Mexico. She won the same at the Caribbean Road Race here in Barbados, and also won the UK National Senior Women's Omnium Series. In track and field, Shane Brathwaite reached the final in the 110 hurdles at the World Championships in London last year. Rivaldo Leacock, the 400-meter hurdler, is on scholarship at the University of South Carolina and training there. Ryan Brathwaite is a World Championship hurdler. Akila Jones, the World Junior Championship gold medalist. And Olympian Jason Wilson, a triathlete competitor in the Olympics. Sada Williams, Mario Burke, Ramon Gittins, Jonathan Jones are among the group of young athletes who are making their mark in athletics. But it isn't easy, Madam President. Akila Jones, in speaking at the National Stadium Sports Awards for 2017, spoke of the hours of practice, the early cold mornings, because she is in the US, the late summer nights, the sacrifices, the missed vacations and family gatherings, the cramps, the pain, and the injuries. So it is not easy for these young people. And we really do have to really find ways to find more efficient and effective support in order to move them to the next level. Our young swimmers have also been doing very well. And most recently, I read of Barbadian, Carifta, and CC Can medalist Louis Sebastian Weeks and Jack Kirby making their mark at the 2018 Tisca, Tennessee State Championships last weekend in the US. Weeks in the 200 IM medley won a gold medal, and Kirby won gold in the freestyle and the backstroke. Together, they were members of a gold medal 200 IM relay team, and both of them will be representing Barbados at the Carifta Games in Jamaica this year. Fellow Barbadian Hannah Gill is now swimming for McGill University in Montreal, also won a bronze medal at a recent meet in Canada. In golf, the Sir Garfield Sobers tournament is oversubscribed every year and provides significant foreign exchange as golfers come in from all over the world to be part of this tournament. I have just learned that the CONCACAF Caribbean Club Shield, the Premier League team, which is last season's Double Crown champions, Weymouth Wales are the champions, and they have been drawn in a Group A of the inaugural Shield, which will be played in the Dominican Republic. And should they be successful, there is scope for Barbados to follow up with this tournament, and in fact, we could in fact be hosting a tournament here. I can't really stop without mentioning surfing, Madam President, because again, here are 2 or 3 Barbadians who are clearly on the world stage. Chelsea Royett, Chelsea Tuek, and Alan Burke. Alan Burke now has his own surfing school. So I think I hope my colleague senators and anybody else who is listening gets the message. Our young people are out there, they are talented, they are working hard, they are performing, and they are doing the name of Barbados proud. We owe it to them to give them the support they need. And Madam President, in the interest of time, I haven't mentioned football really. I haven't talked about hockey, netball, basketball, volleyball, badminton, sailing, rugby, the martial arts, golf, chess, dominoes, darts, motorsports, or even the equestrian sports. But I would have, how many do I have? 19. Sorry? 19. I have 19 minutes? Okay. I'm so sorry. But I think everybody has got the message that that we have an outstanding list of young and talented people. So again, I ask, what can we as a country be doing to take the elite athletes to medaling and to take the broad group of young people in the community to constructive occupations? The Minister of Culture, Sports and Youth has assured us that a sports policy is in the pipeline. And I understand that there's been wide consultation among the stakeholders to include government sporting organizations, national sporting bodies, and of course the Anti-Doping Commission, which is of critical importance. With the rollout of that policy once drafted, I'm certain that it will require additional human and financial resources, which of course includes more coaches, trainers, and a marketing policy. Government currently provides the infrastructure and numerous facilities for sports, both in schools and communities. And the challenge is to ensure that these facilities are adequate and to ensure that at least some of the facilities meet international standards so that when our athletes leave here and go to compete either regionally or internationally, they are familiar with the type of facilities and what needs to be done. Madam President, as glowing as I have been about sports, I do have to hang my head slightly regarding the National Stadium. I haven't seen anything in the estimates which would suggest that something is underway there, and therefore maybe in the next part of my my thinking here, where we're talking about how else we could get some creative funding would be important. Because, Madam President, we do have to, if we are serious about track and field, football, hockey, etc., well, there is a hockey dome, but certainly track and field and cycling, we do have to have a stadium that is at international standards. Barbados Olympic Association President Sandra Osborne said prior to her recent election, trying to find what she said, Madam President. Right. That her commitment is to build a Barbados Olympic Association into a National Olympic Committee that remains committed to the belief that sport has the power to transform lives. Her vision is premised on the recognition that our athletes must always be at the center of everything we do. She speaks of the importance of education of athletes, and she says, we must invest in our juniors. They are athletes of today and our leaders of tomorrow. Sports for development starts with our children and embraces all ages and all schools and communities. The focus is on expanding sport for development programs and using sport as a social platform to teach life skills, and she names them: leadership, strategic thinking, creating a vision, etc. Lessons in collaboration, appreciating the joy of competing, practicing fair play and respect for others, all with a view to developing our leaders and good citizens of tomorrow, capable of making positive contributions to society. And finally, she says the final part of her vision speaks to the mantra that to be truly effective, our sports movement must embrace all members of civil society, not only engaging our key stakeholders, but to promoting and working towards more equal gender participation across the entire spectrum of sport. I looked briefly at the UK government sports policy, and I was interested that they said that through their strategy, government was redefining what success in sport meant. And they had a new focus of 5 key outcomes, and the outcomes that they looked at were physical well-being, mental well-being, individual development, social and community development, and economic development. While I was thinking about this, Madam President, I came across a paper done by a Belgian who is legally trained and international trade and development consultant named Alicia Nichols, and it was on trade law development and policy through a Caribbean lens. She actually wrote this after the Rio Olympics, having seen the success of the Caribbean athletes and in particular of the Jamaican athletes. And she said, much of the discourse on sport as an export diversification strategy is often limited to sports tourism. However, I believe that the opportunities for sports trade go beyond simply sports tourism to encompass a wide array of sporting services, which will be the focus of her article. And under the non-tourism sporting services, she named 4 modes of supply, all of which I think are relevant to us. Firstly, cross-border supply, which is where a sports consultancy firm provides consulting services to clients in another country. Secondly, consumption abroad, where an athlete of one country attends a training facility in another country. Thirdly, the commercial presence, where an investor establishes a sports academy in another country. And finally, the movement of national persons, where coaches provide training in another country. I looked, Madam President, then at the Jamaica sports policy because not having a policy here to look at, I was just very interested in the kernels that were most important in that. And I am sure that our policy, once it is released, will have these similar values, but I really wanted to talk a little bit to share this vision of this policy. And it says that the policy is designed to foster greater participation in sport as a means of enhancing intellectual and physical health, facilitating the pursuit of excellence. It recognizes the extent to which sport strengthens the core values of courage, dignity, fairness, honesty, and integrity, and simultaneously identifies its potential to promote positive societal views of inclusiveness, respect, teamwork, and tolerance. It talked about collaboration among stakeholders, and they listed the stakeholders. I was particularly interested in a sports development foundation, which in fact was established as an independent body to contribute to the development of the nation through sports. And it does speak to the government of Jamaica will encourage sport development with active support and participation from the private sector. And they also speak of niche marketing for manufacturing, they speak of the educational aspects, etc. So, Madam President, in then trying to just kind of summarize the different methods of funding, we are, of course, have the budget, but I noticed that as far as I can see, the budget for the Ministry of Culture and sports in particular, is quite flat. And I do notice that coming up next year, coming up to the Olympics, it is increased, but this year actually it is exactly the same as it was last year. So there is budget support, but outside of that, Madam President, I'm going to suggest some of the things which have come up as I've been speaking. Firstly, tax relief for contributions to amateur sport under the Charities Act. Secondly, the collaboration of stakeholders and targeting diaspora, media, private sector. Thirdly, the establishment of a foundation. Fourthly, niche markets for manufacturing. Planned events for media support. Bilateral funding support, as I spoke to with both the examples of both Canada and Argentina. Training for a fundraiser within the National Sports Council. And I think that's important, Madam President. Fundraising is not easy. And targeting sponsors is not easy. I speak as one who has tried hard over the years with not a lot of success. So fundraising is a skill, and you need training. So I would really make a strong plea that probably within the National Sports Council, they seek to identify one or two people who could get that kind of training so that they can meet with the sponsors, identify their needs, and create attractive programs that the sponsors want to sponsor. And then, Madam President, as we are in 2018, crowdfunding. Crowdfunding was made popular by Barack Obama in his campaign, where you raise many small amounts of funding from large amounts of people, and it's done virtually, it's done online. Part of people's marketing budget could be designed for responsible donating. So I throw out those suggestions, Madam President. I hope that we will see some uptake from it. And finally, before I sit, I do want to make a plea for the vulnerable in our society. And there are two aspects of that I want to speak to. One is the homeless, or are the homeless. I have, how do I say this? I have a vagrant. I know a vagrant very well that I have met over the years. I met him first because I got a call from the post office saying they had a deposit slip there for me. So I said, "You have a deposit slip for me?" I said, "What's the letter?" They said, "No, we have a deposit slip for the bank." So I said, "Okay, that's very nice." I said, "How much is this money?" $1 million. So I made the connection. I said, "That's my friend." All right, so I told them they could get rid of that deposit slip, sadly. But this is a person who I have known over probably 20, 25 years. He has no home. He is constantly on the street. He is between any abandoned place he can find. And then the police find him. They race him out. Very often they take his clothes, sometimes even his ID. Sometimes he goes to Dodds. This is a very sad story. And I have talked, Madam President, I have talked to the welfare department. I've talked to everybody. I've talked to the police. I have talked and talked. I really do feel very strongly that we are judged by how we treat the most vulnerable in our society. And so I read of a 24-hour facility on the lines, on the book somewhere. I really hope, because we have a lot of people on the streets, and this is not good. And this is not good. And my final comment, Madam President, relates again to a vulnerable and to our young people. And again, a comment that I've made before, which is Nature Fund Ranch. I do want to, in the context of looking for funding for initiatives, Nature Fund Ranch has been in the press recently quite a bit, with one or two significant, no, I shouldn't say significant donations, one or two donations. But this is a project which is now catering to 70 young men and women. Most of them have been in problems at some level with the law. Many of them from dysfunctional families. And they have now developed at Nature Fund Ranch a 4-year program. So they have 10 acres of land, 2 acres are used for agriculture, and then the rest is used for, they have horses that they groom and they ride and they feed. They've actually produced a few jockeys from that program. They have 3 or 4 people who have gone on to work in corporate Barbados. And they have pigs that they raise, they have chickens that they raise, they have goats that they raise, and they do eco, what's that called? Eco agriculture. Anyway, they plant in tires and stuff. But basically, they get little bits of support for various things. a program like this, Madam President, which is really saving our young men and our young women, needs sustainable, significant support. And I do want to put on the table that somewhere, in some estimates, I would like to see a project like this supported. Madam President, I am happy to support this appropriations bill, but I do hope that coming out of this, people will reflect a bit on just how much talent we have. And as I said, I haven't by any means made an extensive listing of all the sports. How much talent we have in our young people, and how many creative options there are for government to create the enabling environment, and then also to enable, to facilitate with the private sector to support our young people to the extent that they need to be supported. Thank you, Madam President.